We are witnessing a ghostly echo of 1989, a historical loop where the capture of General Manuel Noriega in Panama serves as the unwritten playbook for what is unfolding in a Manhattan federal courthouse today. The Nicolás Maduro stands before the bench not merely as a deposed dictator pleading not guilty to narcotics charges, but as a man attempting to redraw the battlefield lines from a criminal proceeding to an act of state warfare. When Maduro declares himself a prisoner of war rather than a common criminal defendant, we must look past the theatricality and understand that he is deploying a calculated legal shield against the machinery of the American justice system. The administration in Washington, specifically figures like Secretary Rubio and President Trump, has aggressively framed the Delta Force raid on the Venezuelan compound as a standard law enforcement operation designed to execute a 5-year-old indictment. However, the optics of military commandos snatching a foreign leader create a dangerous fog of war that Maduro is now exploiting. This is not just a trial, it is a collision between two incompatible realities where the definitions of combatant and criminal are being weaponized in real time, and where the specific words chosen by each side are designed to signal legitimacy to their respective bases rather than to the judge. We need to analyze this through the cold lens of intelligence and strategy, because Maduro's assertion is not madness, but a specific survival tactic grounded in the Geneva Convention. By claiming the status of a prisoner of war, he is attempting to invoke international protections that strictly forbid trying combatants merely for their participation in hostilities. If his argument were to hold water, the rules of engagement would shift dramatically. He would only be required to provide his name, rank, and serial number during interrogation, and critically, he would be immune from prosecution for personal guilt regarding state actions. A prisoner of war is generally repatriated at the cessation of hostilities rather than sentenced to a dark cell for decades by a civilian judge, and they must not be held in close confinement unless absolutely necessary for safety. This is the lifeline Maduro is grasping for, yet the reception in Judge Alvin Hellerstein's courtroom suggests this strategy is dead on arrival. The judge has repeatedly cut through Maduro's political grandstanding, signaling that the court views this strictly as a narcotics and conspiracy case, rendering the prisoner of war defense a futile exercise in a venue that operates solely on federal criminal statutes. We must be brutally honest about the operational ambiguity created by the United States, which has handed Maduro the very ammunition he is using to attack the legitimacy of these proceedings. While prosecutors argue this is a clean law enforcement matter, the reality on the ground has been undeniably martial, with the deployment of thousands of troops and warships to the Caribbean and Pacific under the banner of counter-narcotics operations. The administration has conducted a campaign that blurs the lines between policing and warfare, executing dozens of lethal boat attacks that some legal scholars have flagged as potential war crimes, all justified by a secret Justice Department memo classifying drug cartels as enemy combatants. When you enforce a naval blockade of oil tankers and designate the target as a narco-terrorist associated with groups like Tren de Aragua, despite conflicting intelligence reports, you are conducting a war in everything but name. This tactical dissonance allows Maduro to stand in court and claim he is a victim of military aggression, creating a messy legal precedent, even if the outcome of the trial seems predetermined by the sheer weight of the federal indictment. Strip away the diplomatic rhetoric and the high-minded legal arguments, and you are left with the grim physical reality that awaits Nicolás Maduro and his wife Celia Flores. In the federal system of Manhattan, if a defendant is denied bail, They are not housed in a comfortable diplomatic suite, but are thrown into the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, a facility so notorious for its grave conditions that judges have refused to send even low-level drug convicts there. Maduro is now just one of 1,300 inmates in a hulking, troubled facility where the wheels of justice grind exceedingly slow and where cases can take years to resolve. This is the brutal effectiveness of the American judicial system when applied to high-value targets. It strips them of their former glory and reduces them to a booking number in a dangerous environment. The psychological impact of this transition from the presidential palace in Caracas to a concrete cell in Brooklyn is a calculated component of the pressure campaign designed to break the will of the defendant long before a jury ever delivers a verdict. Ultimately, we are watching a high-stakes contest of narratives where both the Trump administration and Maduro are speaking past the court to the global audience. However, as legal experts have correctly noted, a criminal trial functions on the fundamental assumption that the defendant must provisionally accept the jurisdiction of the court and comport themselves accordingly. When a figure like Maduro completely resists this premise, clinging to a prisoner of war status that the court does not recognize, the result is not a diplomatic breakthrough, but a finding of obstruction. The intelligence community knows that while words matter in geopolitics, jurisdiction matters in a courtroom, and no amount of invocation of international law is likely to derail a federal drug trafficking prosecution that has been years in the making. The cold hard truth is that while the operation to capture him may have looked like war, the mechanism to punish him is purely civilian, and that is a grinder that rarely lets its captives go. Let us pivot from the courtroom strategy to the operational theater, because that is where the administration's narrative faces its sternest test. We must scrutinize the sheer scale of the military mobilization that preceded this capture, as it provides the factual bedrock for Maduro's defense. For months, the United States has not merely engaged in law enforcement, it has orchestrated a naval blockade and a kinetic campaign in the Caribbean Sea and Pacific Ocean that mirrors a state of war. We are talking about thousands of troops and a dozen warships deployed to checkmate a single regime. The administration describes these as counter-narcotics operations, but when you look at the track record of dozens of lethal boat attacks over the last 4 months, legal experts are right to raise the red flag of potential war crimes. A secret Justice Department memo attempts to sanitize these strikes by claiming we are in armed conflict with drug cartels, but that is a legal stretch that blurs the line between policing and combat operations to a dangerous degree. The complexity deepens when we examine the intelligence underpinning the narco-terrorism label attached to Maduro. The administration has asserted a direct link between the Venezuelan leader and Tren de Aragua, a gang designated as a terrorist organization. This is a powerful rhetorical weapon designed to strip Maduro of any political legitimacy and cast him as a threat to homeland security. However, as an intelligence professional, I must point out a critical fissure in this narrative. U.S. Intelligence agencies themselves have contradicted this specific claim. When the political leadership pushes a narrative that the intelligence community cannot fully support, we enter a zone of vulnerability. If the prosecution relies on these terror links in court, and they are exposed as tenuous or politically motivated, it could weaken the entire case. Maduro knows this, and his defense team will likely probe these intelligence disconnects to paint the entire indictment as a fabrication of foreign policy rather than a product of criminal justice. We must also look at the historical mirror of 1989, because the ghost of General Manuel Noriega is the silent co-defendant in this room. The administration is explicitly citing the capture of Noriega in Panama as the legal precedent for snatching Maduro. But let's be clear about the difference. Noriega was captured during a full-scale invasion involving 27,000 troops, an undeniable act of war. In Maduro's case, we saw a surgical strike by Army Delta Force commandos, a raid taken without congressional approval, which the administration insists was merely assisting law enforcement. This semantic gymnastics is intended to bypass the War Powers Act while achieving a military objective. By relying on the Noriega precedent, the administration is inadvertently admitting that this is a military-style extraction, which paradoxically strengthens Maduro's claim that he should be treated as a prisoner of war under the Geneva Convention rather than a common drug trafficker. Finally, consider the behavior of the judiciary in the face of this geopolitical storm. Judge Alvin Hellerstein's interruptions of Maduro's speeches are not just procedural, they are a judicial firewall. By refusing to let the courtroom become a platform for debating the legality of the capture, the judge is enforcing a clean trial focused solely on the indictment. He is telling the world that once a defendant is inside the Southern District of New York, how they got there is irrelevant compared to what they are charged with. This is the male captus bene detentis doctrine in action: bad capture, good detention. However, the friction between the judge's insistence on a standard criminal trial and the defendant's insistence on his status as a kidnapped head of state ensures that this will be a chaotic, obstructive, and drawn-out process, likely dragging on for years within the grim confines of the Metropolitan Detention Center. We must now confront the dangerous precedent being set when a superpower decides that the boundaries of a sovereign nation are merely suggestions rather than laws. By invoking the capture of General Manuel Noriega in 1989 as the blueprint for this operation, the administration is engaging in a high-stakes gamble with history. We have to remember that the invasion of Panama was a massive, overt military campaign with a clear declaration of intent, whereas the extraction of Nicolás Maduro was a covert insertion of Army Delta Force commandos operating in the shadows. The distinction matters because when the United States argues that a military raid is simply a law enforcement assist, we are effectively telling the world that our domestic criminal laws have universal jurisdiction, enforceable by the barrel of a gun anywhere on the planet. This is the very definition of imperial overreach that our adversaries in Moscow and Beijing love to exploit in their propaganda. Maduro's claim of being a prisoner of war while legally shaky in a Manhattan courtroom resonates politically in the global South, where the memory of American interventionism is long and bitter. He is betting that even if he loses his freedom, he can win the narrative war by painting himself as a martyr of American aggression, a symbol of resistance against a hegemon that respects no borders. Let us strip away the high-level strategy for a moment and look at the brutal, tactical reality of what happens when the state decides to crush an individual. The Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, where Maduro and his wife are currently held, is not merely a jail. It is a weapon of the state designed to erode the human spirit. We are talking about a facility that houses 1,300 inmates under conditions so grave that federal judges have previously refused to send defendants there. This is the cold, hard truth of the American justice system. The punishment often begins long before the conviction. For a man accustomed to the presidential palaces of Caracas being reduced to a number in a hulking, troubled facility where movements are restricted and isolation is the norm, constitutes a psychological shock that no amount of bravado can withstand. While international law and the Geneva Convention dictate that prisoners of war must not be held in close confinement and should be released when hostilities end, the reality of federal detention is indefinite and crushing. The administration knows this. They understand that while the legal arguments grind on for years, the physical reality of the MDC will be doing the work of breaking the defendant day by day, hour by hour. We must also scrutinize the intelligence disconnect that hangs over this entire affair like a dark cloud. The administration has labeled Maduro a narco-terrorist and linked him to Tren de Aragua, a vicious Venezuelan gang designated as a terrorist organization. This rhetoric is designed to make him radioactive, to ensure no nation dares to speak in his defense. However, when U.S. intelligence agencies themselves contradict the political leadership's claims regarding these specific links, we are treading on dangerous ground. In my experience at the CIA, nothing destroys credibility faster than politicizing intelligence to justify a predetermined course of action. If the prosecution brings these terrorism charges to court and the evidence is thin or manufactured, it will not only embarrass the Justice Department, but will also hand Maduro a propaganda victory that he will broadcast to the world. We saw this with the boat attacks in the Caribbean, where the administration claimed intelligence-linked vessels to drugs without presenting public evidence, leading to lethal engagements that legal experts call war crimes. When you operate in the dark without congressional approval and with disputed intelligence, you risk turning a law enforcement success into a strategic liability. In the final analysis, the outcome of this collision between the Trump administration and Nicolás Maduro will likely be decided not by the Geneva Convention, but by the sheer grinding weight of the federal bureaucracy. Professor Daniel Richman is correct in his assessment that a criminal defendant must provisionally admit to the jurisdiction of the court, and Maduro's refusal to do so creates an impasse that will only hurt him. The judge has made it clear that there is a time and place for political arguments, and that place is not his courtroom during an arraignment. We are looking at a process that could take years to work through the courts, a slow-motion collision where the defendant's cries of kidnapping and war will eventually be drowned out by the procedural drone of motions, hearings, and evidence. The United States has decided to treat a head of state as a common drug lord, and having crossed that Rubicon, there is no turning back. The message to other adversaries is clear and chilling. Sovereignty is no shield, and once you are in our custody, the only laws that matter are the ones written in Washington, not Geneva.